In 1108, the rage of the sea did overflow and drown a great part of Flanders, upon which the inhabitants, the Flemings, besought Henry I of England to give them some place to remain in, and who, being very liberal of that which was not his own, gave them Ross in Dyfed, or West Wales, where are built the towns Haverfordwest, with Pembroke and Tenby, and there are a sort of people of industry exceeding their neighbours. So said the Duke of Beaufort during his tour through Wales and visit to Haverfordwest in 1684. The area that is mentioned, Flanders, roughly equates to modern Belgium. Here the Flemings had achieved enormous success by sheer hard work in reclaiming coastal land for farming, and in the skills of cloth manufacture, working precious metals, and not being afraid to fight to defend it. Their fighting abilities had already forged for them close links with this country, in that William the Conqueror had used them as mercenaries during his invasion in 1066. The subsequent rewards he was obliged to give them meant that there were scattered Flemish colonies in England, where they quickly integrated with Saxon and Norman. But here in Pembrokeshire, it was to be different. After evicting the native Welsh from the whole of South Pembrokeshire, they established a foreign settlement where Flemish was spoken for many years, giving way slowly to English. Welsh language, custom, and culture was eradicated. It was along this river that their quest took them. The spot they chose had much to recommend it. A wide navigable river, essential for communication and trade, going far inland out of the prying eyes of coastal marauders. As far as the eye could see, there was good land which they could turn to farmland, and as an essential bonus, at the river's most navigable point, a natural, commanding platform of rock, ideal for the building of a strong fortification, a castle.
The castle was founded by a Fleming named Tancred in 1110. The initial structure was timber, but efforts to convert this to stone must have started soon after. In 1188, Geraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald the Welshman, tells us that a stone castle existed and relates to the tale of a prisoner in one of the towers who seized the young sons of the lord of the castle and held them to ransom against his release. There followed not long after, in 1220, the first major military action which the castle must have experienced when Llywelyn the Great, as part of his efforts to control the whole of Wales, burnt the town up to the castle walls. The fact that the castle withstood such an onslaught gives an indication of its strength. In 1284, the castle enjoyed a major refurbishment following the adoption of it by Eleanor of Castile, Queen of Edward I, during their stay whilst on a visit to St David's. Eleanor borrowed vast sums of money, and it is recorded that £407 was spent on carpentry alone. It is considered that the huge windows which have dominated the townscape ever since are as a result of her remodelling of the layout and designs. And this south-facing area formed part of what is even now called Queen Eleanor's Arbour, or garden. Eleanor Eleanor had little enjoyment out of her provincial retreat and died in 1290, only a year after the work had begun in earnest. There followed over the centuries intermittent military activities. Another burning of the town in 1405, when French forces supporting Owen Glyndŵr once again failed to take the castle. And during the Civil War, when it was found politic by the townsfolk to entertain whomsoever appeared in the town with the largest force. It was during the Civil War, however, that the castle was stormed, the walls scaled, and the attackers under Roland Larn were successful. This action on the 2nd of August 1645, following the victory at Colby Moor just outside Wisson by Larn for Parliament, appears to be the only action in which the attackers were successful. Although by this time, militarily, the castle was considered a decayed wreck, its use by royalists and parliamentarians throughout the Civil War allowed Cromwell to consider that for the purposes of retaining peace, it should be demolished. There followed an exchange of the famous Cromwell letters, which arrived in between his visits to the town in July 1648. But after an initial show of commitment to the orders by the town council, the matter was quietly shelved. In 1779, a prison was constructed against the south wall, and in 1820, this structure was built as the new jail, where later alterations allowed the accommodation of 110 cells. But to return to the Flemings, as so often happened with the building of a colossal structure such as a castle, a community started to mushroom around the walls. A large workforce was needed, which was required to live on site. Masons, carpenters, labourers, cooks, farriers. All of these people needed food, clothing, a place to live. And so, around the base of the castle walls, the township was formed, which crept ever outwards. Initially, Queen Square is considered to have been the first marketplace, and this area took the name of Castleton, from which the nucleus of the town developed. Such a numerous body of people needed the food of the soul, in addition to their stomachs being filled, and the frenzied building of places of worship took next precedent.
We are here in the parish church of St. Mary in Haverfordwest, not the oldest, but certainly the most decorative and architecturally presentable of the three churches in Haverfordwest. And certainly very much at the centre of things. We forget that the three churches would have very much dominated the township and seen from many, many directions. St. Martin's, of course, is the oldest, associated with the castle, which overshadows it, and St. Thomas was not long after that, because all three churches represent the cults which were part and parcel of a religious revival going through Europe at that time. St. Thomas of Becket, of course, had been martyred in 1170, and his martyrdom seemed to influence a great deal of that religious revival. We forget sometimes that there is a church dedicated to St. Thomas of Becket in Milford Haven as well, hidden from sight, but not far off the Rath. And to think that that cult penetrated westward at a tremendous rate. St. Martin, of course, St. Martin of Tours, was a great soldier saint who had a great influence on the spread of Christianity through Western Europe. And St. Mary here herself was part of the cult of the Virgin, which was also one of the great cults which influenced the whole of the Christian evangelization of Western Europe. So we are part of a tremendous heritage. And then you remember that these weren't the only churches. There was a friary church and certainly a priory church. And so to think in terms of a small township having 5 very impressive places of worship points to the ethos of the day. They were never meant to be filled, strangely enough. They were meant to be worshipped in and were, but they were never meant to be filled. You have to imagine these churches without their pews and chairs, a rush-covered floor, many places having an altar, certainly chantries for masses for the repose of the soul of benefactors, and if there was any seating at all, they were benches around the walls, which is, of course, the origin of the saying, the weakest go to the wall. And so we need to realize that these churches were very much places of worship. People came to daily mass. They said their prayers here, as popping in as they passed. They were also meeting places. Certainly a market was probably held in this church. But there were certainly meeting places for the people of the community. And what, of course, is remarkable is here, many, many centuries later, they are still used for their original purpose of worship and as meeting places, not in the same sense perhaps, but certainly as meeting places for the people of the township.
St. Martin's is the oldest of the town's churches which had its origins in the 12th century within the walled Castleton area. It was dedicated to a saint popular in the Norman period, St. Martin of Tours, who achieved fame in the 4th century as the Roman soldier who gave his military cloak to a beggar. The tower was added a few hundred years later, with the original spire possibly a little later again. As with almost every church, St. Martin's has been through a long existence involving peaks and troughs of decay and restoration, and the structure we see here now is the result of much rebuilding and addition. By the mid-19th century, the tower and spire were found to be so unsafe that enormous buttressing work had to be undertaken, and a new spire, approximately 15 feet shorter than the original, was built. The fact that St. Thomas's Church is dedicated to Sir Thomas of Becket means that it must have been built after 1173 when he was canonized and before 1210 when it is first mentioned in the records. The tower, like that of St. Martin's, was a later addition. Except for the tower, the church was demolished in the 17th century and a replacement, smaller structure built. Again, in the 19th century, the church underwent major upheaval, though this means that what we see here is in the main of comparatively recent origin. This church is connected with delicious legend and has associations with the town which go back much earlier. Here we have the memorial to one of Lucy's family, Sir Richard Walter, a remarkable man who served the town well. Charles, later Charles II, is said to have married local girl Lucy Walter secretly in this church. In the 3.5 centuries since, there have been exponents of both sides of the argument as to whether he actually married Lucy or whether she was just one of the long list of mistresses which Charles became known for. Still perhaps a mystery is why the church records were sent for by authorities in London after the supposed marriage and never returned. More factual but equally romantic and of course tragic is the story behind this headstone. Samuel Fortune died after fighting a duel with his best friend John Jones. The duel, fought as a result of a trivial argument, took place in September 1799 in a field located where the Trimtail starts at the entrance to Fortune's Frolic. The tragedy, if not sufficiently played out already, takes on an extra dimension with the fact that Samuel's betrothed, Mary Jones, sister of his killer John, died shortly after of a broken heart and is said to be buried here as well. Haverfordwest Grammar School has had a long association with the area around, if not in the church of Sir Thomas a Becket. This elaborate lion on the tower is very similar to the motif adopted by the school. A print of the intended alterations to the church in the 1850s shows the then grammar school building in the background. Of the town's churches, it was St. Mary's which was to become the mother church. There are a variety of reasons for this. The most important building, the Guildhall, was located not only in the parish, but was annexed to the church itself. In addition, the townhouses which the county gentry had built for themselves in the parish of St. Mary's necessitated their owners worshipping there. This gave the church valuable endowments and attracted the interest of these people of influence and means. Around St. Mary's developed the twice-weekly market, which was the hub of the wheel around which the town existed commercially and domestically. For centuries, the churchyard and its surrounding streets took on the noisy, chaotic market appearance, with favoured positions being adopted by vendors of similar produce. There are reports from a comparatively short time ago of buyers being afraid of the habit of some butchers in hanging their meat wares against the church wall. The height at which they were hung seems to have corresponded with the depth of the graves on the other side. In the minds of the then inhabitants, this allowed the consequent seepage of the decaying bodies through the stonework and into the meat. This church, as with others, has had a variety of additions and alterations. The difference here is that much of what is seen today dates back to the 13th century and is of a quality unsurpassed certainly within Pembrokeshire and even further within South Wales. The quality and the very size of the church, almost cathedral proportions, suggests that there was a desire to impress and to make the point that the church was worthy of being the corporation church. The tower is, unlike the other churches, part of the original construction and, until 1802, had a spire. It was taken down in October of that year as a result of a survey commissioned by the church wardens, which showed the lead-covered timber structure to be wholly unsafe. A visitor to the town of national renown as a songwriter by the name of Charles Dibdin actually wrote a song about the town which mentioned the state of the spire.
Oh, Haverfordwest is a mighty fine place, where Welsh hospitality shines in each face. Only walk through the streets and you'll find my words true, for each countenance seems to say, howdy-do. If the truth of my ditty create any doubt, just step to the door and take a peep out. You will see the church steeple with spire all askew, as if it were nodding, howdy-do.
The tower houses now, and has done for many centuries, the bells which have a fascinating history and sound of their own. Until 1766, there were 5 in number, and in that year a decision was taken to recast the 5 with some additional bell metal to create a peal of 8 bells. a Mr. Bailey of Bridgewater in Somerset undertook the task and submitted his bill on the 15th of May 1766 for £103, 4 shilling and twopence. Inscribed on each bell is a message. The most famous and one adopted by the Civic Society is on bell number 6, which reads, "I do my best for Haverfordwest." By 1633, even with only the 5 bells, the town council felt compelled to order that they not be rung every time someone died. In the same year, a further decree was needed to prevent the burial of any more people in the floor of the church, such was its popularity. Henceforth it was decreed only the great were to be buried inside. There is ample evidence that this was enthusiastically adhered to. This memorial is to William Bowen, who deserves to be remembered. In the second plague of 1652, William Bowen attempted, with the help of the Reverend Stephen Love, Surgeon Benjamin Price, and a mysterious visitor woman, to govern the town gripped in the nightmare of bubonic plague. The lives of an estimated 400 out of 2,000 were lost to this visitation from God, as the plague was described, and all public buildings, like this church, were fumigated by burning pitch in them.
From William Bowen of the Common Council of our beloved Haverfordwest, to Thomas Davids, Mayor of Haverfordwest, at the Black Lion, Fleet Bridge, Ludgate, London. To my dear kinsman and fellow member of the Common Council of our beloved Haverfordwest, you have left behind you a sad place. I hope that your efforts to see General Cromwell and persuade him to ease the rates burden on our stricken town meet with a higher degree of success than can be said of the efforts we made here to diminish the visitation that the Lord our God has seen fit to cast against us. I wish I could say that since your leaving, the government of the town has continued in a sound and true manner. But I fear that is not the case. Were it not for William Jones and James Griffiths, we should have nothing done here. For despite the ruling imposed by the High Constable of Dungleddey that none shall leave the town, those that are fortunate to have residences elsewhere have fled, and with them the officers of this council.
The indignity of having pitch burnt within its walls would have to be considered a minor event in comparison to the use of the church almost 150 years later as a prison for a large number of the French invaders in 1797. Every church, the castle, and some warehouses on the quay were full of the hungry, ill-clad prisoners. There is a record of damage having been done, and this ape, who used to play a harp, is one who suffered at their hands, his harp having been removed. There can be nothing that this church has not seen concerning the town during most of the last millennium. The Guildhall or Guildhouse dominated the town from the 13th century onwards, obliterating much of St Mary's Church to viewers coming up the High Street. A large building supported on pillars in a lavish Jacobean style, in which were heard the courts of great sessions, and underneath, in a vaulted ground floor, a shambles, the medieval term for slaughterhouse. The county records hold the most appalling catalogue of trials and punishment. Martha Phillips, imprisoned for stealing 36 pounds of coal in the depths of winter. A 16-year-old girl imprisoned for opening a family's documents and valuables box, although it was acknowledged that she had taken nothing out. And a 7-year-old boy for accidentally wounding someone with a scythe. The Guildhall was demolished soon after the building of the Shire Hall, which was completed in 1837. And in here began a history of trials, the first major ones being those of the Rebecca rioters. The dawning of the 19th century would see considerable changes in Haverfordwest, as in many other county towns throughout Britain. The 1835 Municipal Reform Act wrested power from the squirearchy and burgesses and paved the way for democratic local government. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, and in the history of Haverfordwest, that man was William Owen. A person of considerable drive, intellect and ambition, William Owen had a grand vision for the town he knew so well. Thomas Lloyd takes up the story from the Shire Hall, the jewel in William Owen's crown.
I'm sitting in the judge's chair in the Shire Hall, William Owen's greatest building, and indeed I'm sitting on a chair made by his firm of cabinet makers, seated in front of this lovely dais, which also is his firm's workmanship. William Owen was a very remarkable native of this town. He was the son of another William Owen Senior, who in turn was the nephew of Owen, who in mid-Georgian times had an upholstery business here in Haverfordwest, which had flourished. He had died in 1808, and William Owen Senior took on that business and expanded it into a cabinet making, furniture making, and a building business. And his premises were in Short Row, a triangular island of housing, which amazingly enough was in the main street, exactly outside the Shire Hall, where the Shire Hall is today. And indeed it was one of William Owen's tasks in the 1830s to demolish the buildings where not only his father's and his own premises had been, but possibly even the house that he'd been born in. William Owen Senior had succeeded very considerably in life, and when he reached old age in the 1830s, he was rich enough to go to Clifton, to the hot wells there, to try and prolong his life, as many people did, many people with money did. But he died there in 1830, leaving his son, William Owen Jr., to take on the business. And indeed, from that point on, or at least rather from before then, because William Owen Jr. had been running the firm in the 1820s, from then on the firm expanded in the most astonishing way, both as an architectural practice, as a furniture making practice, and as a building practice. And throughout the course of William Owen's life, he was to have that sort of business acumen that brought him immense wealth, immense success, and perhaps even more difficult if you do both those things, immense amount of respect in Pembrokeshire. One of the things that he is best known for, perhaps, is for being mayor of Haverfordwest 4 times, which no one else had ever achieved. It was a lifetime that brought him honours. He became High Sheriff, which is an unlikely thing for a man born as very much the merchant, the working people of Haverfordwest. And indeed, he was to meet the Queen in 1842 when he took a loyal address from the people of Haverfordwest up to Buckingham Palace to congratulate her on the birth of the Prince of Wales. He was also High Sheriff in the 1850s, and he had tried to become the MP for Haverfordwest. He wanted to stand as a Liberal, but he was just too soon in the Victorian period for people who weren't aristocratic, or at least gentry, to be allowed to stand as a member of Parliament. Everyone rather pooh-poohed his suggestion that he might stand, and as it was, a typical Pembrokeshire gent became MP and really didn't achieve a great deal, whereas if William Owen had become the MP, there's no doubt he would have worked his guts out to improve things in Pembrokeshire. As it was, he'd had to, well, he didn't have to, he spent a lot of time promoting such things as roads and railways. He became a director of 3 local railways down here, including of the regional director of the South Wales Railway, later the GWR. And if things weren't suiting him, if he didn't think things were going to his fancy, he would simply get up to London and go and see people like Brunel, who were planning the lines for the track, and simply say things had to be done differently, and by and large they usually were, because people had immense respect for for William Owen, and indeed it was only because of William Owen's pushing that the railway line actually came into Haverfordwest at all. Brunel's first plan had been to miss out Haverfordwest completely. That's perhaps an overview of his general career. His greatest single work was the building of this great Shire Hall in the middle of the 1830s, in this fantastic classical design with this huge D-shaped chamber within, set up on these lovely ionic columns all around us, and this beautiful domed ceiling above us with skylights in it to light the courtroom from above. It's the most marvellous piece of architecture. It stands comparison with courthouses anywhere in Britain at the time, and it is a great, great ornament to this town. So far as we're concerned in the cabinet making, the building and the architectural line that made Haverfordwest the place as it is today, we know that from the 1820s he was already the leading architect and builder in Haverfordwest. In 1824 he had designed the new market in Market Street that sadly has been demolished. That's the earliest drawing and work that we know he did. But from then on his rise was fast and rapid. In 1832 he became the county surveyor for Haverfordwest, which means he was in charge of bridges, workhouses, all of the public buildings in town. But his great moment was to come in the year after and the years immediately following, with the decision to build the new main road into Haverfordwest over the new bridge that was to be built, and to create this great new thoroughfare going straight up to St Mary's Church.
Before then, anyone coming into Haverfordwest in a carriage had to come over the old bridge up the north, down Bridge Street, turn in Castle Square, and then come into the High Street, and really there was very little space. It was very cramped and awkward. The Regency period was one where a great deal of thought went into town planning, and here in Haverfordwest a really major exercise was put into action. They had to get an Act of Parliament to do it because a great deal of building had to be knocked down. The road, which now seems to run so straight and clear up to the bridge, had in the 1820s been built over totally, and so they had to get permission to knock a lot of premises down and pay compensation, and of course that all went to the courts and took a long time. But eventually everything was sorted out, and William Owen was able to get on and create this wonderful roadway up into the town. He was able to build his bridge and create this wonderful vista up to the church by knocking down Short Row, the triangle of buildings in the middle of the street, indeed where his own workshops had been, and then he was able to, right at the top end of town, underneath the church, he knocked down the old town hall as well and built the great new Shire Hall in 1833 to 35. And then when the road was done and he built his bridge, he then built the two terraces on each side of the road, Victoria Terrace of 1838 and the slightly smaller terrace opposite. And indeed he probably designed the county hotel that starts the vista now. Even today this is still an absolutely thrilling sight as you drive up the street. It's one of the great urban vistas in Wales, and really as one looks at it from here it really is still an absolutely thrilling sight, and the great visual joy of Haverfordwest town. Behind me is Herman's Hill House in the very fashionable part of Georgian Haverfordwest, which came on the market in the middle of the 1830s, and William Owen, by then married to his London wife with some money, and money of his own from his father's death. His father died in 1830, and indeed with the considerable earnings he was making both from his own business and from being county surveyor, bought it. You can see it's a large house, and beautifully set over the edge of Haverfordwest looking eastwards, and the first thing he did
was to improve the front entrance of it by adding this range with the two very typical bows on the front, typical Regency bows, which Owen was to come back to again as a design type for country houses. And he made this into a very fashionable house with this very smart front entrance to give people who came past an idea that a chap of some status was living here. Behind me is the Corn Market. This was built in 1847, and it says a great deal for the wealth of Pembrokeshire's agriculture that such a large market for corn was needed here. When the council was considering building it, they first thought possibly of having a competition, but everyone said, oh no, must be William Owen. William Owen was actually rather bashful about it and said, no, if I design it, people will feel scared about criticising my design. But anyway, no one was going to have that. William Owen was required to design it, and here it is, a fine square building at the top of Market Street. Now, of course, considerably changed, having become a cinema in the middle of the last century, but nonetheless still a fine building, showing a lot of his architectural qualities. The Castle Terrace, as we can see from the plaque up here, was built in 1832. It's a terrace of 7 houses, and although there's no paperwork to tell us who designed it, we can be quite sure that it was by William Owen, because it has numerous details about its architecture which are typically his. This large band running between the ground floor and the first floor is a very typical design detail of his, along with these rounded front doors with the skylights over them. Again, typical Owen details. Also of interest are the railings, the cast iron railings, and indeed the iron plaque on each end of the terrace here, because these would be the work of Joseph Mary Church, who was a close colleague of William Owen's and who ran a very large iron foundry here in Haverfordwest and produced many of the ornamental ironwork designs that we find in front of many of the important buildings in the town, such as the Shire Hall, for example. But here is a small example of his work, and again in this rather lovely dated plaque on the corner of the terrace. Scolton was built in 1840 for the Higgin family. The Higgins were an ancient Pembrokeshire family in the Haverfordwest area, and their previous house here had burnt down in the 18th century, and they'd lived in Haverfordwest for a couple of generations before rebuilding their ancestral home in 1840 using William Owen as the architect. And what's particularly nice about this house from my point of view is it's the only house where the entire documentation survives in writing of William Owen's rebuilding, and we know from that he designed the house and was responsible for the interior fittings, the layout of the interior, the whole business from architecture, building and furnishing was looked after by William Owen. So it's very nice to have that documentation. Now, the Higgins were not a hugely grand family. They were of what you'd call middling fortune, so they couldn't afford to waste a vast amount of money on their house, and William Owen was exactly the sort of chap to go to, a man who avoided extravagance, a man who was very, very practical, and all that can be seen in this house, which has no extravagance in its elevations. There's no fancy Bath stone, there's no great carving. In fact, it's a rendered house, a cement rendered house, and all the detail is put onto it by the use of the raised keystones over the windows brought out in the cement, and the band round it, the typical Owen band, is just in raised cement. So you get tremendously effective results, but on a relatively small budget. And Owen was particularly good at that. He has really got the best value out of every pound. And the result that we have here is this solid, unostentatious, but clearly very comfortable rectangular house, which is exactly what one would look for from his work. Something that's absolutely right for the sort of person it was designed for. And I have no doubt that when the job was done and they'd paid the bills, they were extremely happy with what they got. We're just a couple of miles north of Haverfordwest now at a lovely house called Cottesmore, which was originally built around 1800 and was a small house then called the Cotts. And then in 1839 to 40, the Massey family wanted a bigger house, so they doubled it in size, and after that it became called Cottesmore, which is a nice story. It seems to be true. But the architect they employed to double the size of the house was undoubtedly William Owen. No documents, unfortunately, but everything about the style of the building, with the big band in between here, the top floor and the middle floor, is a typical Owen feature. The compactness, the squareness, the no-nonsense approach of it all is entirely William Owen. The grace of the proportions really being the main source of the architecture, except of course for this tremendous and rather unexpected colonnade along the bottom, giving this great loggia in front of the house of 8 columns. Now, they're Bath stone, which means they've obviously come from a way away over the Cotswolds, and I have a suspicion that in fact they're second-hand. There are 1 or 2 marks and grooves in them which indicate they've come from another building. Alas, we don't know where they're from. The Masses perhaps got hold of them somewhere in some country house demolition sale, and they've set them up here in front of their house to form this very grand and graceful ground floor, supporting this nice Doric entablature above to form this very nice loggia or veranda under the front of the house, which you can imagine in lovely sunny weather would be the most lovely place to sit. So a rather unusual touch of grandeur here. These columns which they've got hold of and added onto the house, but a very obviously William Owen type of house, rather like Skelton. No nonsense, but very graceful, compact and well planned. We're now at Picton Castle, the great mansion of the Phillips family, a couple of miles east of Haverfordwest. And this room that we're in is part of the block that was built onto the castle in the early 1790s. That's before William Owen's day. But in the 1820s and 30s, William Owen was paid over £1,000 by the Phillipses to come and renovate parts of the castle. And one of the results of that renovation were these glorious doors that we see here in the dining room. Now, I suspect that in the 1790s, looking at the width of this door, they were double doors that opened that way, and they'd gone out of fashion by 1830, and so it was decided to put these glorious mahogany doors in. And what we have here are, I think, some of the best surviving or the best known examples of the cabinet making workshop that William Owen owned and ran, which he had many employees, 30, 40, even up to 50 people employed in his workshops, turning out the finest woodwork and carpentry that could be done for the period. And these doors are astonishing examples, very, very good quality mahogany with this lovely patina and pattern on them. And this lovely quarter-round moulding with these inset bobbin and reel decorations here. And this lovely bobbin and reel again in the centre here to mark the middle of the doors. Very wide these doors are, several feet wide, as you can see, much wider than the average door. And they're very heavy and they're beautifully made. And what's even nicer is, of course, that they're exactly the same on the other side, but the pattern slightly differs. Instead of the bobbin and reel, we've got a pie crust moulding here. So enormous amount of work has gone into these doors. They're very heavy, they're beautifully made, they're on 3 great hinges to make sure they hang absolutely perfectly. This is cabinet making and house fitting out at its very best. And finally, just to show off in beautiful contrast, we have these beautiful ivory fittings, door handles and keyholes here, absolutely beautifully made. There are 3 of them in the room, this main door and then the service doors for the cupboards that were in the walls. This is absolutely superb work, and it's come through to this day, perfect condition, just to show how beautifully made they were in the first place, and what very, very high standards William Owen employed. William Owen, of course, was equally famous for his furniture production, and we know that a huge amount of high-quality furniture was coming out of his workshops. And what we have here at Picton, this fine dining room table and the set of dining room chairs that go with it, are possibly very good examples of his work. Now, unfortunately, he didn't sign his furniture. It wasn't part and parcel of the way things were done in those days necessarily to sign everything, so we can't be sure. We can only go on style. And one of the pointers to this table actually being a William Owen table is that we do know that he loved to have darker inlays in his wood, and we do know that a lot of his furniture, particularly chair backs and things, had inlaid details very like this, and so it's very likely but not certain that this is a very fine dining room table by William Owen. And these chairs, again, we're not certain if they're his, but they are very much in the style of the furniture that would have been made at that period. And alas, unless you find accounts of in record offices of country houses where the documents have survived, the bills have survived, one can never quite be sure. But he was making furniture certainly of this quality, and we know that a number of country houses in Pembrokeshire had enormous orders from William Owen's workshops in those houses. Lampfey Court, for example, there are bills for £500 worth of William Owen's work. At Stackpole Court, we know that William Owen was very busy there. He was paid many hundreds of pounds for work he did at Stackpole. So clearly William Owen's quality product was absolutely up to what the grandest gentry of Pembrokeshire needed, and that's really, I think, the highest compliment you can pay him. The man had enormous standing. He was hugely respected in almost every field he worked in, both in the building world, the furniture world, and indeed later on in the local political world. He was mayor of Haverfordwest 4 times, as I've mentioned, but he was a councillor for about 40 years. Was one of the first elected under the new Councils Act of 1835, and he remained on it for 40 years until finally old age caught up with him. By when he was living very much as a country gentleman at Poyston, at Rudbaxton, north of here, and he had built up for himself a large landed estate of several thousand acres around Pembrokeshire, and he was regarded as an extremely good and kind landlord, very efficient landlord, but also one who was very much respected by his tenants. In an age when there were certain grumblings from landlords who were taking too much and not putting enough back in, he was a man of a very high reputation. He is buried at Rudbaxton under a very prominent pink granite cross, along with his wife, who was a Londoner. In fact, he'd gone to London in 1831 to find a bride for himself, Martha Hall Stevenson, again, which I think shows his ambitions. And he had a large family. Perhaps the most famous in Pembrokeshire terms is Dr. Henry Owen of Poyston, the famous Welsh historian. Of course, all his children had become landed proprietors. They'd become gentry, all had large inheritances under his will. Another was George Leader Owen, who took some very fine photographs of late Victorian Pembrokeshire. There was James Albert Owen, who became a Church of England vicar and spent much of his life in the East End of London, doing enormously good work among the poor, and of whom a biography was written. And then there was William Stevenson Owen, who became a judge, and indeed who has a plaque on the wall here beside me, an important judge of the South Wales circuits. And indeed in the next generation after that, some of the grandchildren married into great English country houses, and when I was going round one in Nottinghamshire some years ago, I saw an engraving of William Owen on the wall, and upon inquiring the gentleman I was talking to, the owner of the house, was indeed a direct descendant of William Owen. So it's rather remarkable that William Owen, having begun life in the early 19th century as a tradesman in Haverfordwest, who quite possibly need never have gone further than that, through his incredible hard work and his talent and genius, ended up producing families in great houses in England.
Just as the churches played a fundamental role in 12th century Haverfordwest, so the chapels played a significant, if not so fundamental, role in the 18th and 19th century. And whilst the origins of non-conformity can be traced back to the Green Meeting and the building of the Albany Chapel, the chapels, as we know them today, are largely the product of 19th century expansion and rebuilding. Certainly, the impact of non-conformity on the town was substantial and can be measured by the number of chapels which were built and the large congregations which supported them. Historian Robert Scurfield explains.
We're standing outside Albany Congregational Chapel at the moment here on St Thomas's Green. Chapels are a very familiar sight in our towns and villages across Wales. The majority of them are 19th century in date, as is Albany. And I think there's a mistaken logic in Wales. People think that non-conformity grew in the 19th century, perhaps with the rise of the working classes. And indeed, so many of the working classes were non-conformists. As you can see, the origins of the chapel go back far earlier than the 19th century, and indeed in the case of the Baptist and the Congregationalist denominations, their origins go back to the Civil War years of the 17th century. Now, Albany Chapel has got a very good case for being the first independent or congregational meeting house in Wales. As you can see with the top plaque there, the foundation date is given as 1638. Now, if that's true, that's a year earlier than the officially recognised earliest meeting house in Wales, which was at Llanfaches in Monmouthshire in 1639. Now, unfortunately, the early records of the chapel have been lost, so that is just a tradition that's been handed down to us. But I would like to think, being a local historian, that perhaps Albany is indeed the earliest independent meeting house in Wales. There's another plaque on the chapel which tells us that it was built in 1655. That's rather unlikely because most chapels tended to be built shortly after the Toleration Act in 1689. But we do know that the Congregationalists were meeting here on St Thomas's Green in the 1650s, and perhaps the date refers to the formation of the Green Meeting, as it was then called. And indeed, the little vestry on the right-hand side of the chapel is said to contain portions of walling dating from the 1650s. We do know, however, that the first proper chapel was built here on St Thomas's Green 2 years after the Toleration Act in 1691. Like so many chapels across Wales, Albany has been rebuilt time and time again since it was first founded. And between 1839 and 1841, the chapel was almost totally rebuilt, not, as in the case of many a Welsh chapel, by a local builder or surveyor, but by the town's leading architect and citizen, and also conveniently member of Albany, William Owen, who of course was the noted improver of the town in the early Victorian period. And the style he chose, unusually, was a Gothic style. People don't generally associate chapels with a Gothic style, rather smacks too much of the established church. But the English congregations in particular tended towards the Gothic rather than the classical, whereas when you travel across the Welsh countryside, the Welsh-speaking denominations, if they could afford it, they liked to build strongly classical churches as opposed as anything to the established Church of England. Very unusually, the chapel originally didn't have any windows opening into the body of the church. It was actually top-lit because houses abutted the chapel on each side. And the only window of note was this one above the porch, which was actually bricked up, I believe, in the 1960s. The facade originally faced into St Thomas's Green, but when they rebuilt the chapel, they turned it round completely, rather more fashionable, and set it behind this little railed forecourt and facing these newly built houses along Hill Street. So Albany, all of a sudden, had become something of a fashion statement rather than a simple meeting room. Like many Welsh chapels, the interior has been entirely remodelled. We're not quite sure what the original 1841 interior looked like, but the chances are it had typical high box pews and a small tub-like pulpit here at the far end. But by the 1870s, this all must have seemed a little old-fashioned, and it was decided to go a little more upmarket. So the decision was taken to rebuild the galleries, and a local architect, D. Edward Thomas, was appointed to do the job. The deacons, however, weren't quite so sure. The costs seemed high to them, and they queried the wisdom of doing it at all. But the minister at the time laid down the gauntlet by saying, "You build the galleries, and I'll fill them." Above, however, still survives the original top-lit windows, which makes this chapel almost unique in the whole of Wales. A second phase of renovation followed in 1890, when D.E. Thomas was called back again, this time to fit these very fine pitch pine pews. More important than the pews was this very fine platform-style pulpit, and these pulpits were increasingly important in the late 19th century as congregations participated in regular worship. And the final phase of restoration involved this extraordinary framework behind the pulpit, constructed of pitch pine, a dominating classical edifice, designed, I think, to give even the most timid minister a little bit of hoyle in the pulpit. The facade of Tabernacle is extraordinary and certainly unique in the whole of Wales. It's slightly Janus-faced in that it's a serious piece of Roman architecture, almost very, very heavily classical, but given a very, very delicate paint scheme, compared by some people locally almost as a wedding cake. The interior of Tabernacle is among the finest of all chapel interiors in the whole of Wales, and it certainly explodes the common myth that non-conformists like their buildings plain and simple. Clearly, the architects Lawrence and Goodman, when they refitted the interior in 1874, certainly went to town, using the most up-to-date materials and techniques of the day, cast iron columns, and these fine wrought iron vinework balcony fronts. Even more impressive and unusual is the fine coffered barrel-vaulted ceiling. And here, behind the pulpit, the apse with its cabling in the half-dome, almost alluding to the very name of the chapel itself, Tabernacle, the tent in the wilderness. However, the plan of this chapel, with its nave and aisles, almost a basilical plan, which is quite in itself unusual for a non-conformist chapel, was dictated by the earlier chapel on the site of 1774. And the plan of that chapel was apparently based on the Bristol Tabernacle, the plan of which was supposed to have been suggested by the prominent Methodist George Whitefield. And it's interesting that Whitefield actually visited Haverfordwest and preached here in 1768. And I wonder, did that man suggest the plan of the original chapel? The interior of Ebenezer certainly comes as a surprise. It's much more intimate on a much smaller scale than larger chapels such as Tabernacle and Bethesda. And that's because in 1885 the chapel was entirely replanned and overhauled, so that the front facade was added towards the roadside to contain 2 large schoolrooms, and this actually is the original chapel within the 4 walls that was first built in 1817. So it's an unusual and a skillful piece of chapel planning, an unusual entry to the chapel in that you've got to come up steps off the street front to come into the main chapel itself. But the Presbyterians, or Calvinistic Methodists as they're also called, were quite canny in their building campaign as well, because they added the front 2 schoolrooms first of all, then they worshipped in the top schoolroom, and while they worshipped in the top schoolroom, they were busily refitting out the old chapel in 1885. All of this interior belongs to 1885, carried out by a skillful local architect, D.E. Thomas, who also renovated the chapel at Albany. Very simple, typical late Victorian interior, an attractive pulpit with some very attractive little detail, the little colonnettes, very, very skillful woodwork in the pulpit, and also this rather attractive cast iron bow-fronted balcony. And the Victorians were obsessed with new building materials. Cast iron to them was a wonderful product. And of course, as we've seen in other chapels, they were obsessed with ventilation and new building techniques. And this quite grand plaster rose in the ceiling is quite simply a ventilator dressed up in fancy classical garb. Hill Park. The chapel was established in 1858 for the Welsh Baptists by James Rowland, local coal merchant. His chapel is the present Sunday school, left of the present building. Owing to the small number of Welsh speakers in Haverfordwest, however, English-only services were held from 1880. With the increase in population in the 1880s, the chapel was rebuilt between 1888 and 91 by George Morgan, architect of Carmarthen. Morgan had rebuilt Bethesda in expensive dressed stone, but here cheaper moulded cement is used, but to great architectural effect. Remarkable too is the huge date and name of the chapel picked out in yellow brick on the gable end. The interior is typical of George Morgan and late Victorian chapels in general, with a gallery running along 3 sides, incorporating finely detailed cast ironwork panels, and of course a large pipe organ. Typical of Morgan too is the arcaded pulpit and the ribbed ceiling, complete of course with the central rose disguising a ventilator. The interior of Bethesda Chapel is in many ways typical of its architect George Morgan of Carmarthen, most notably the very fine cast iron gallery front. He used that in several chapels he built for the Baptist across South Wales, and that really displays, I think, the Victorians' obsessions with new building materials and also new building techniques. For instance, up in the ceiling, the large decorative lozenges are actually ventilators. In the floor are set iron gratings for the central heating system. So when this chapel was built, it was centrally heated, it was well ventilated, and not only that, but it had the great luxury of the baptismal pool under me here, under the big seat in front of the pulpit. So no longer do the Baptists of Haverfordwest have to baptise in the western Cleddau, and certainly tales abound of members breaking the ice for people to get baptised. Well, here in Haverfordwest they really knew how to live it up, because you could get baptised inside a centrally heated chapel. One of the most extraordinary features of Bethesda is this very quirky, if you like, this Gothic tabernacle-like structure behind the pulpit, and like Albany, designed to give the preacher more eminence in the pulpit. And of course, the most important feature in any Welsh chapel of whatever denomination is the pulpit itself, because it contains the Bible, it contains the preacher who utters the word, and in the chapel that is the ultimate importance. Moravian cause in Haverfordwest was set up following the preaching of William Griffiths, a member of the London Moravian Church in 1746. Among the first converts was John Sparks, who set up a meeting room in Bridge Street. The church was officially established in 1763, and from 1768 to 71, John Gammold, son of the rector of Puncheston, was its minister. The chapel itself was built in 1764, rebuilt 1773, and renovated in 1853. The little chapel flourished until its closure in 1957. 4 years later, it was demolished and replaced by flats. The Catholic cause was fostered by Father Peter Lewis in a small converted cottage in Dew Street from 1845. As the cause grew, the old cottage was improved, and after 1871, under the guidance of Father Cullen, fundraising began for a new church. The present church, dedicated to St. David and St. Patrick, was designed by the architect Richard Williams of Carmarthen and was opened on the 26th of April 1872, having cost £700. The small interior is surprisingly akin to a non-conformist chapel with its rear gallery. Improvements were made in 1905, including new windows, but with the growth of the airbase at Brodie, the number of Catholics in the locality grew, and a large extension was made to the rear in 1960, forming the present L-shaped plan.
One could be forgiven for thinking that the social and commercial changes which were sweeping across 19th century Britain, arising out of the momentum of the Industrial Revolution, would hardly reach Pembrokeshire, this remote westerly peninsula. But they most certainly did, and sizable industries were established in and around Haverfordwest which would provide significant employment for generations to come. We join Sybil Edwards in a most unlikely setting on the banks of the Western Cleddau.
Years ago, my parents had friends who lived at this very fine Georgian mill house, which is just a few miles north of Haverfordwest. And when we visited, I was allowed to wander among the ruins of the mill, which was nothing like as dilapidated in those days as it is today. We were probably among the very few people at that time who knew of its existence. And certainly today, I think it can be regarded as Haverfordwest's secret treasure. The long and interesting history of the mill has been well researched by Robert Kennedy, who's here with me today. You were telling me earlier that it was particularly well built and there were very fine facilities for the workers. Now, why do you think that was?
One assumes, without sufficient proof as yet, that the Lloyds were a Quaker family, and like so many Quaker entrepreneurs of that time, it would be quite natural and a total explanation for these facilities to find that they were building according to the most enlightened manner, providing amenities for the workers, such as was not usually the case.
Yeah, so these amenities, what were they?
They had lavatories on each side below the pediment front, and little offices with a fireplace in each, balancing one another on each floor, the 3 floors. And the sewerage went away into subsidiary mill leats, so that the sanitation was quite well organized.
Yeah, that was very progressive. Yeah, and the building itself, very well built. And
extremely well built. Superb cut sandstone footings, and lintels and archways and so on. Lovely brickwork, pure lime mortared. And gorgeous rows of gorgeous Georgian windows, all painted white at one time, which you can barely make out now because of the covering of ivy.
But the quality of the building probably accounts for the fact that so much of it is still standing, even though we've lost a lot of it.
Yes, sadly the beautiful pediment front with its oriel window in the centre has gone, probably because it was cantilevered out and the weather and the ivy got there first.
Yes.
I'm afraid we lost it a few years back.
Yes, yes. Right, so here it's a different era, is it? It's after the time of the Harveys?
Yes. After the Harveys gave up running the mill, Samuel Reed established himself and evidently modernized. He altered the mill race and acquired a two-stage vertical flow turbine, which we see there. At least we see its shaft, and it's covered with wheat growth at the moment down below. This was a magnificent piece of machinery produced by Brighton Garrod of Carmarthen Ironworks, and I don't think we mentioned the date. It was 1874 when this was established. So that the machinery was apparently run by this with shafting going across into the main mill building.
Yes. So once again, this was very modern for its time, was it?
Yes.
Advanced?
It was advanced, indeed.
Yes.
But of course, sadly, too late.
Yes.
And gradually the paper milling ran down, subsisting on making poorer and lesser quality papers until finally, 1890 or so, it gave up.
Yes.
And subsequently was used for various other materials that could be milled or crunched according to the needs of the time.
Such as? Do you know what they were?
Making dog biscuits was one during the First War, and milling bones for a short time.
Yes.
A practice which is usually manages to destroy the mill machinery in the process.
Yes, yes. So do we know when the mill finally closed?
No, I don't, but I do know that it continued, the buildings continued in use for a variety of uses, right up until the last war.
Oh, right, yes, yeah. Since which time it's been allowed to fall into decay?
Yes, very sadly.
Very sadly, yes. I'm standing at the back of Bridge Street on the riverside in Haverfordwest, where this plaque by the Civic Society marks the site of the foundry and ironworks that were established by the Mary Church family. The origins of the family go back to the 17th century, but it was Solomon who established the foundry, which is identifiable in this mid-19th century print by its tall chimney. His grandson Joseph Mary Church, who was born in 1802, became an influential figure in the town and was appointed sheriff in 1829 and mayor in 1865. He expanded the business to include ironmongery, a timber yard, and the manufacture of a large range of agricultural machinery. By 1810 they were able to boast royal letters patent for some of their products. The cast iron mileage posts, which are still very much in evidence beside our roads, are a product of this foundry, but under later ownership. From the perspective of this view outside Ebenezer Chapel and looking towards the bottom of Barn Street, it's a little difficult today to visualise the site of Llewellyn's Churn Works, which was at one time one of Haverfordwest's largest businesses. I'm at Scolton Manor Museum, a few miles north of Haverfordwest, where there is this excellent display of dairy equipment which has been manufactured by Llewellyn's Churn Works. And with me today, somebody who worked for the Churn Works for some long time is Mr. Dowie James. Right, so here we have some of the butter making equipment, yes?
Yes.
Well, they put the butter on the table, and they would sprinkle the salt, and these rollers then would, the table would turn, and these rollers then would put the salt into the water, into the butter.
Ah, yes, I see.
And you had to be very careful. They probably tested the butter to see if it was saltier and enough, you know.
They had a taster, did they?
Well, possibly. So that's what that is really about.
I see, yes.
But then we got the smaller little hand. Now, these were sold probably to a farm, small farm, and they would get the butter, put it in that, and they would turn the handle. And this again was purely for salting.
Yes.
So that was, and the wood, it is a very white wood, white soft wood at the base of these things. And I've never seen that particular timber ever since I left the churnworks.
Well.
It is a very special timber because it's easy to clean.
Ah, yes, yes. Very close grain, probably.
Yeah, well, it's a soft, very soft timber.
Yeah.
And that's what happened then. And all these things then it just goes along with it. And the frames were made, most of them are pine. These are the smaller churns.
Yes.
And then on that side of it, I mean, that's
and that's the separator, is it?
That's the separator, yes.
Yes.
That's what that is.
Yes.
And that's about all I can remember about these here.
Oh, right. Yes, thank you. Yeah, right. This is the Victory churn, which won the firm the highest award at the Royal Agricultural Show in 1919. Now, Kenny Bright, who's here with me today, worked for Llewellyn's Churn Works for a very long time, but it wasn't with them in 1919. However, he did work on this churn. But when did you start with the Churn Works, Ken?
It was in August the 23rd, 1948.
1948.
Yeah.
And you were with them until they closed?
It was not until they closed itself. I was there when they finished doing the churns, but naturally the Ferguson side took over then, you see.
I see.
So the churns finished all together.
Oh, right, and you finished before that, right, yes. So tell me about what you were doing with the Victory churn.
I would get the barrel from the cooper, which was Mr. Sidney Evans in those days, and the barrel itself, you just had the barrel, no fittings on it at all, just the plain barrel. And the first job would be to give it a coat of polish. Now, the polish consisted of shellac, methylated spirits that was mixed up and then left overnight. So the next morning you give it a first coat of polish. Then after that, the second job then was to fit the actual spindles on. So what you've done, you've got a ruler and you put along the side, you turn the churn, and very often you'd have the spindle run up and down like that.
Yes.
So you'd loosen the nuts off. You then get cardboard of all things.
Yes.
And put the cardboard in until you straighten it up.
Oh, right,
and
yes.
it came level then. So that was that done. Then you turn to the actual cover. You had to put all the fittings on here. And then you had an over-center catch, which on the later ones came up that way. You also had a rubber band around there, and then you had the big weight that went on the bottom naturally to keep it down, because otherwise the churn would have a tendency to, drop over to where the lid was. So all your weight then was on the bottom.
Yes.
So you put your drain plug then, which was down there as well. So what happened was, when the butter actually was made, you had buttermilk left inside.
Oh, yes.
So you took your plug out, and then you drained the liquid off from the churn itself, and then you was left with the butter inside.
Oh, right, yes. With the decline in the demand for dairy products, Llewellyn's diversified into a number of other items, including poultry sheds. And here we have a model made by Kenny of one of the poultry sheds that I think you were involved in making.
Yes, the whole thing of it was they made quite a few different ones. There was the small one, which they called the Lilliput. They called them field houses, they did. So when they came onto this particular one, This one you either had felt on the top or zinc. Naturally, the posh one was with the felt. So what happened was, these used to be situated in the field, and then with the wheels you could move it along to a different position when it suited.
Yeah.
So the end part here was the part where the eggs were
complete with chickens,
laid,
yes.
and then
Yes.
retrieved then from there. You also had the little door in the front for chickens going in and out. Plus you had then, for cleaning it out, you also had the door then which you approached
Yes.
to clean out inside.
Yes.
With the perches all across inside then.
Yes. I see you put a ramp in to stop them slipping.
Then when you, inside the windows, there was wire netting put there, and the idea of it was that if the window was open and there was any foxes naturally about with the doors closed, they would get into, so they put wire netting inside.
So they got air, but were not vulnerable.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I was talking to Simon Llewellyn, who is a son of the last of the Llewellyns to have worked in the churnworks, or to have run the churnworks.
Yes.
And he was telling me that when he was a child, he went into his father's office and there was a big map on the wall there with pins stuck in it, and each pin represented a country that Llewellyns had exported to. And he looked at this map and he thought, I don't think there are any countries left that they can stick pins in. To the churnworks and other exporters of local products, the arrival of the railway in December 1853 was a major event, linking Haverfordwest to the rest of the country. And to the people of the town, a new opportunity for much wider travel at a price and speed which they could never have imagined. For the ancient port of Haverfordwest, however, whose seafaring links stretched back over many centuries, there was a very heavy price to pay. Barry Burgess takes up the story, sailing up the Cleddau.
The western Cleddau, steeped in the history of centuries, its wooded shores the haunt of heron and shelduck, Canada goose and cormorant, an ancient highway to an ancient township, a place of mystery and intrigue. But it wasn't all misty sunsets and salt sea spray. A living had to be earned, a hard living, a cruel living, and over the years the little ships plied their difficult trade among its muddy banks and shifting sands, bringing their cargoes of wine and salt and fruit, mahogany and teak from far-off places. Over the centuries, the trade changed considerably from the days when foreign-going sailing ships took their exotic cargoes up to the quays in Haverfordwest. They were replaced by small, shoal-draft steamers and motor barges, delivering local products such as limestone and culm. There were, however, exceptions.
I'm standing opposite the site of the delivery of the very last cargo to Pembrokeshire by sailing ship. That sailing ship was the topsail schooner Kathleen in May, and her skipper was Captain Tommy Jewell. Amazingly, the year was 1960.
This very fine photograph of her unloading was taken at the time, but of course this is Ford's Quay at Pembroke and not Haverfordwest. However, a number of sister ships like the Result and the Democrat traded up to the gas quay at Haverfordwest well into the 30s, and Arthur Clegg of West Williamston, shown here with his family alongside the motor barge Vesper, traded until 1939. But let us return to the Cleddau of today as we approach the quays of Haverfordwest, led by the pilot gig Integrity, where we meet Wyn Jones, chairman of the Civic Society, who has studied the history of the port.
The port of Haverfordwest, or Haverfordwest as it is often referred to, has a very long but largely unrecorded history. The town was placed in a very favourable position because of two factors. One is the lowest point on the river where it was fordable, hence its name, Haverfordwest, and also it has the river has a very high tide, and this enabled shipping to come into the port. It is difficult for us to imagine life before the coming of the railways. In those days, transport out of the county, or indeed within the county, was on horseback, and it was only the river that could accommodate goods. In later years, a brisk trade developed within the River Cleddau, as coal, culm and limestone were moved up and downstream between places like Hook, Creswell Quay, land shipping and the developing towns. Quay Street, which linked the town to the port, was up to 1654 known as Ship Street. In 3071 there is a reference to E. Limekiln in Ye Ship Street, and connecting Ship Street down to the river is Potter's Lane. In 1777 it is recorded as Ye Potter Lane. There are four historical quays. Upstream of the new bridge is Skinner's Quay, and then on the new quay there are two warehouses. One, however, was burnt out in 1906. It belonged to one Edgar Rees. One, however, still remains. Then further down we have the Wool Market, and this is a building on the old quay, or referred to sometimes as the town quay. Now the Wool Market is gable end on to the river and has a dated stone on the south face. The stone refers to the corporation and to the mayor and is dated 1777. And the mayor at the time was one Mr. Rees. We then have the famous Bristol Trader, its name indicative of the boats that plied in and out, and they were known as the Bristol Traders. The building is also very clear in the buck print. The building retains its 18th century form, but parts of the building are no doubt much older. Also a listed building. We then have the group of warehouses further downstream. Next to the Bristol Trader is the building of 3 stories with its hipped roof, and one time was the Joseph Rank Warehouse. Next again down is the large and the most imposing of the surviving warehouses. This is 4 stories and the roof. It also has a mansard roof, which indicates that it has 2 slopes. Beyond that you can just see the former meeting house, reputedly used by the Quakers or the Baptists or indeed the Moravians. It has a chamfered southeast corner, and it was also possibly the customs house. Further downstream is the last of the quays to be built, the Hanover Quay. It is first mentioned in the records in 1735, and this was in the time of the Georges. The Georges, of course, were the Hanoverians. This is the borough seal of Haverfordwest, and this side, the obverse, shows a ship. The ship is a limphad or sailing ship of the 13th and 14th centuries, with its sail furled as though in port. It signifies the great maritime importance of the town of Haverfordwest, which was further recognised in a charter of 1479, which conferred the title of the Admiral of the Port upon the Mayor.
The end of the Victorian age and the beginning of the 20th century heralded more change for Haverfordwest, as for many other country towns, but for a while the town continued much as it was for the previous century. The monthly cattle fairs were still very busy on St. Thomas's Green, and horse-drawn barouches from the Salutation Hotel still met their customers at the station. The assizes were an excellent excuse for much pomp and ceremony, and the annual parades of local lodges were very much a feature of the town. But the Edwardian era would bring with it the internal combustion engine and the motor car, and 2 local companies were quick off the mark to exploit its possibilities. John Andrew Bland, accompanied here by Ernie Holt, is very proud of this 1909 Rover, and Fred Green demonstrates the versatility of his machine, and the first generation of motor lorries could now be seen on the streets of the town. Meanwhile, the outbreak of the First World War brought army parades and manoeuvres in and around the town, and fathers and sons and brothers marched off to the trenches of Flanders, never to return. Let us not forget that generation of Pembrokeshire men tragically cut down in their prime.
It's a long
But the 1920s brought with them a new feeling of hope and optimism as the town embraced a new era. These Sharabang parties leaving Cartlet are full of anticipation for a day of enjoyment in the countryside and on the coast. Local expectations were also catered for by the businesses of the town, and in particular at Commerce House, the department store in Market Street known as the Harrods of West Wales. Journalist and local historian Derek Rees takes us through the coming decades, commencing with the Davis sisters who worked at Commerce House and well recall the town between the wars.
Well, I've got 2 Haverfordwest born ladies with me, 2 sisters who worked in Commerce House, that wonderful emporium of Haverfordwest, which was known, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless very truly, as the Harrods of Haverfordwest. I've got Miss Vi Davis and her sister Mrs. Lillian Warlow, and we're going to just chat about Commerce House. I think I'll start with Miss Davis. You You joined Commerce House, I think, very early on.
Yes, in 1927 I was 16 when I went there, and things were quite different then to what they are in the shops today. We had to be in by 9:15 in the morning and see that all the showrooms were right, the department we worked in. We used to cover everything over at night, and then we take all those off in the morning ready to do the dusting and put everything in order.
And 5 days a week?
No, 6 days a week.
6 days a week?
Yes. We started at 9:15 and we finished at 6 o'clock at night. An hour at lunchtime.
Yes. And which department did you start in?
Well, I started in what we called the mantles, which was coats and dresses and that sort of thing. Jumpers and cardigans, and there wasn't a very big variety of other things then in those days.
No. And how long did you stay there?
Well, I was there from 1927 till the year war broke out, 1939.
39. When you had big occasions in the assembly rooms, for instance, a ball or a dance or whatever, did the people come in then?
Oh yes, they used to come, especially evening when they had the posh dances, and they used to have the bank dances, the hospital. They'd all be in for that. You know, we used to sell a lot of evening frocks in those days then.
And we'll come to Mrs. Waller. When did you go to?
Well, after I left, I was 16. Yeah. I went as a receptionist, and we were very busy because there were not many hairdressers about in those days, and we did perms and trims, and we sold the best cosmetics and perfumes. And as I said, when there was a hunt ball, we had to go work on Thursday afternoons then. You used to work late.
Yes.
And it was very interesting because we met more or less the same people that came to Commerce House, came to the hairdressing, you see.
Yes.
And we were always kept very busy.
Yes. When was the first time you ever left to go any distance?
I can't remember really. But we used to have our Sunday school treats.
Yes.
Of course, in the old channel bands then,
yes.
You know, down to Broadhaven.
Broadhaven.
And tea then, Mrs. Brooks, was it?
Yes.
There. And all the others have plain cakes and currant cakes and buns then, and coming home in the channel band, we'd all be given a bun again.
You'd be singing on the way?
All the way, lovely. We came home much quicker than we went.
What about boat? Did you do boat trips for the chapel as well down the river?
We've been Hill Park, yes. We've had, we used to have, we had a couple of boat trips down the river, and that was very enjoyable. Yeah. It's a lovely river.
Summer evening.
Yes. Yes, lovely and still. We got into the harbour and then it was cold.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Happy days.
Happy days, yes. Yes.
I'm talking to my friend of many, many years, Mr. W.L. Bill Richards, 88 years young, I understand.
Yeah, I can't believe it. No, I can't.
We've been journalists together for at least 50 years, if not more, and we're going to have a look through these cartoons by Matt from the Daily Sketch. I'm told they were produced in 1935, of characters of Haverfordwest, characters who Mr. Richards, Bill, knew very well.
Yeah.
Mr. Mortimer Thomas, popular mine host of the Hotel Mariners, international Sealyham Terrier judge. I'm told you don't know a lot about him.
No, I knew him, but I don't know a lot about him now.
No, but we'll move on to Sidney Bowler, who also was a Sealyham judge.
Yes.
And reader.
Yes. And very successful businessman.
Yes.
And a very nice man. He had no side about him at all. He was marvellous. Liked him very much.
Very unassuming, you were saying?
Very unassuming man, yes. And he kept all his members of his family, 3 or 4 boys, all stayed in the business, you know. And it was a very successful business.
It was in the large building that used to be Reese the Grocer's, you said?
That's right. In High Street? In High Street, yes.
Yes. Right. And you used to visit him regularly?
I did. I went to see him about various things, about his dogs, which he exhibited all over the country actually, and very successfully. They had the candle name of Bowit.
Oh, Bowit.
B-O-W-H-I-T.
Ah.
Bowit, and they were Bowit Beauty, Bowit, whatever.
King, Queen, Marquis, Duchess, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. They were all Bowits. And this is, I know it sounds a bit odd now perhaps, but it was a great thing because the name became well known all over the country.
Yeah. Yeah. But he was president of the Chamber of Trade at this time. You said he was a very shrewd businessman.
Oh, he was a very shrewd businessman, and you see that did it, yes.
Yeah.
He was never on the town council that I remember.
No.
But lots of people thought he should be because he was such a shrewd man and a good businessman. You know?
Yes. And here's another man who was involved with the council, Mr. F.R. Lowther.
Yeah, he was
an accountant.
He was an accountant, that's right.
Yes.
Qualified, very clever accountant he was.
Yes.
I found out there. Yeah. Milford man.
Was he?
Came to Haverfordwest to work with, well, no, he came to Haverfordwest. He set up
his own business?
In business as an accountant, and was given the job of treasurer to Haverfordwest Council, that part-time job.
Yes.
What I remember about him mostly is that he would come to the meeting. Obviously, he was part-time. He wouldn't totally obliged to the town council, so he treated him with a bit of contumely, and he would walk out and down the street, have a smoke and come back, and nobody had the nerve to say, "Where have you been? You're supposed to be here." But that's what they thought.
Yeah.
But he didn't hear a damn. He was a very nice chap actually once you knew him.
Yes. Because he's smoking very heavily there. He was
smoking all the time. Yeah.
And this, we move on to John Nicholas.
That's John Nicholas, who was...
He was a councillor too. Councillor as well.
Yeah, he was a councillor, that's right. And he was the boss of Commerce House, which was in Market Street, and was... well, what could you call Commerce House? Can you remember Commerce House?
Yes, Emporium, I suppose, wasn't it? It was a...
that's a good name for it, Emporium.
Yeah.
It sold... drapery and
haberdashery
and all that.
Hats, millinery.
That's right. And it provided employment for a lot of local people. I know about Commerce House because my sister worked there. She was a milliner.
Yes.
And me being about 12 at the time called her a millionaire.
Yeah. Yeah. But he was quite an enterprising man.
Oh, a very enterprising man, yes. And he didn't suffer fools gladly. John Nicholas, he was a big boss in his way, but he was well thought of, he was well respected, and very successful.
Yes. And the next to him is a county councillor, no less, Alderman
Dawkins.
T.R. Dawkins, was it?
T.R. Dawkins, Thomas Randall Dawkins.
Thomas Randall Dawkins.
Yeah. He was, yes, from Haylet. They were a local family who were regarded as a cut above the ordinary people in Haverfordwest. There's a lot of that in those days. Don't exist now.
No.
But in those days, for some reason, like the Dawkinses were a cut above everybody else. Yeah. But he was a very amusing bloke. He talked in it with a high-pitched sort of sing-song voice, and it was everybody knew him by the way he talked,
And he was chairman of governors of the grammar school, I believe, at one stage.
Yes, and Taskers.
And Taskers.
Yes.
Because I seem to remember him presenting prizes at a speech day.
Yes, that's right. You're quite right, Derek. He did.
Yeah. And then we've got W.E. Lees, who was secretary of the NFU.
Yes, great chap, W.E. Lees. Who he was a farmer, actually, but he was not the usual run of Pembrokeshire farmers. He obviously had some education, and
was secretary of their nephew.
So he was your old boss?
He was my boss, J.W. Hammond, Joseph William Hammond, born in Dorset. Came down to Pembrokeshire when he was 22 years of age to a district reporter for the Guardian, which was then at that time printed in Solva. And J.W. Hammond came to Haverfordwest as district reporter in Haverfordwest, which was really the centre. And he was responsible in the main for having the Guardian moved from Solva into Haverfordwest.
Yeah. Initially to Bridge Meadow, was it?
Initially to the Bridge Meadow. And then up to Market Street.
Yes. To Brigstock's old shop in Market Street.
Brigstock, that's right. Yes, J.W. Hammond did all that.
And he's the gentleman who gave you your job at the age of 15?
Yes, he did. He did, and he said, I went in with a letter from my old schoolmaster saying what, I don't know. I didn't look at it. I was afraid. But he opened it and had a look, and he said, oh, okay. Start on Monday then. And the so casual, like, you know. And I can't pay much. Things are pretty tight now. And that's all I heard from him all the years I was with him. Things are pretty tight.
But he was a very firm boss, but a good boss.
Yes, he was very fair, very shrewd, a good journalist, there's no doubt about that. An able man. And I thought the world of him.
Let's come down to, we've done John Nicholas and these. Yeah. R.T.P. Williams now. Howell Williams' grandfather. R.T.P.
Oh yes, that's right.
He was a character.
Yeah, R.T.P. ruled Haverfordwest for years because of his strong personality and his knowledge. He had great power because he knew everything. Do you know what I mean?
He was a solicitor?
He was a solicitor, and he was in a position of authority and influence, and he knew how to use these attributes or gifts, or whatever. Yeah. He was a very powerful man, R.T.P.
Town clerk?
What's it say there?
It says Deputy Lieutenant there. Richard Thomas Propert Williams, Deputy Lieutenant, County of Pembroke, solicitor in practice for 59 years.
That's right, that's him.
Yeah.
He was a man of great influence in Haverfordwest. If somebody wanted something, you know, the cry was always the same, well, go and see R.T.P. You know.
And then we've got Councillor Mrs. M. Thomas, first woman councillor, unopposed.
Well, she became an influence in the town, an influence to be reckoned with. You know. And she was the first woman, see, that...
a pioneer. And of course from the Sadlers in Key Street.
She was, that's right. The brother, well, the family ran the Sadler's shop. And they were quite prosperous. Sounds odd today to be prosperous on the Sadler's shop, but they were. Because things were different then, you know.
All horses and carts then. And
yeah, that's right.
And there's another Thomas, of course, Mr. Arthur H. Thomas, County Surveyor.
Yeah, didn't know him.
You didn't know him?
Well, I knew him, but I didn't have anything to do with him.
Another cigarette man?
Look at the cigarette on his lip.
Yes.
And he did do it.
His lip, yeah.
He did do.
Yeah. And then, of course, Mr. Wheatley, the clerk of the County Council, clerk of the peace.
A man of great power.
Yes.
Who was, who had the brains to use the power, you know.
Yes.
He knew everything and he used it. Very good. And he had the county councillors in the palm of his hand. He could do what he liked to them. He's very good.
Sounds familiar today.
Well, yes, that's right.
Did they all stand in awe of him? And
yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, they certainly. They wouldn't admit to being in awe of him, but they were.
Yes.
And if he suggested something, it was done always.
Yes. And then we come to Alderman Leslie Ellis, the big promoter, it says. He was mayor of the town a few times, wasn't he?
4 times, I think.
And a very influential man.
Extremely influential. He had the gift of the gab. He could stand up and speak on any subject with a double hat. He was marvellous. And he could speak and go on and on and on. And when he'd finish, you think, oh, that's good. And you think back and after, well, what the hell did he say? He didn't say anything. No, that is true.
Like a modern day politician.
Yeah, he could talk. Hind leg of a donkey without saying anything.
Yeah.
Marvellous, isn't it?
But he was active, very active in sport, soccer.
Yeah, well, yes, he was very keen on soccer. Well, all sport actually, but soccer mostly, and he was secretary of the Haverfordwest RSC. AFC.
Yeah.
And
promoted boxing matches and that sort of thing.
He was known as the big promoter.
Yeah.
Is that there?
It says there, yes. Yes.
And this is what he did. He organised tournaments, sporting tournaments of various kinds for years and years in Haverfordwest.
Yes. But this is Canon Phillips now. He was a marvellous man, wasn't he? It said here, it defends the old crypt.
Yeah. Well, there's a crypt by the entrance to St Mary's Church.
Yes.
And they were going to pull all that structure down there by the entrance to the church.
Yeah.
And then somebody said, he in particular, you can't do that. This is one of the ancient monuments of Haverfordwest. And people on the town council, like Walter Roberts, and all said, well, of course we can. It's a waste of time. And a row developed, and this row went on for years. What should they do with the crypt?
Yes.
And this was in the paper, you know, what to do with the crypt. And hence this cartoon of the club, you know.
Yes.
He defends, don't you say?
It says, Canon Phillips defends the old crypt. Trespassers will be annihilated.
Yeah, very good.
But he retired to St David's.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I knew him as an old man in St David's when I was a boy. He used to come and play chess with my father.
Did you, good gosh?
Yes.
Fancy that?
Yeah. The outbreak of the Second World War saw the frantic building of airfields across Pembrokeshire, and in 1942 the military hospital at Withybush was opened almost simultaneously with the completion of the airfield nearby for the RAF's operational training unit equipped with Whitleys and Wellingtons. Meanwhile, as Vi Davis told me, Commerce House was commandeered to accommodate soldiers.
When Commerce House closed, was it a sudden sort of thing, or was it sort of gradual?
No, it was sudden. Yes, it was sudden then, because the war was on then, you see, and they had to billet the soldiers in the town. So Mr. Nichols gave it over to the army. They cleared everything out then, you see.
Yes.
Had like a sale, and then the soldiers went in there and billeted in there.
No.
They were there all during the war.
Yes.
Mrs. Peggy Munt also remembers the arrival of the soldiers in Haverfordwest.
Oh, these soldiers came, young boys from Cardiff and that, you know, 18-year-olds and that, 4th and 5th Welsh. And they were billeted then in Commerce House. Mr. Nicholas gave up. And in the market, in the Masonic Hall, Grill Hall, and Herman's Hill House. And they all went for their meals up to the Market Hall.
Oh, I see.
And Sunday mornings when it was quiet, you know, you're in bed, you could hear them marching up and singing, they hang out the washing on the Siegfried line and all. Oh, they were going up as jolly as anything. You know, the town was full of all these boys. So, yeah.
But with the end of the war, there was a desperate urge to return to normality, and Jack Holt remembers the post-war dances at the drill hall.
Regular on a Saturday night just after the war, when I come out the forces, I started the old dance band up again. Well, you'd have 1,000 people in there, because the soldiers was all around this way, Manavere, Brodie and all those places. And there was never much trouble there, not like like's happening today. Like in the drill hall, we'd have one or two come in there, perhaps the worst for drink, but we had a bouncer in there, and they used to say, right, here's your money back and don't come in again. And they weren't allowed into the hall again, so that was their punishment.
Audrey Thomas, whose family ran the old mill inn in Salutation Square, remembers many of the old family businesses in Market Street.
And funnily enough, the lady who's come next door to me here, a couple of years now, originally a native of St David's, And she learnt her trade in scissors. Yes, millinery. Strange world. Miss Page, Mr. Page was in Bowlers. Miss Page was person in charge up in Saces there. Bob Sace, of course, knew them well. Oh, the Herberts. Yeah, wonderful old place.
Yes,
wonderful. Yeah, wonderful.
All gone.
Yes, yes, all gone.
In Castle Square, the purchase of part of the Castle Hotel by Woolworths for their new store changed the complexion of the centre of the town, and the wholesale demolition of Cartlet and Salutation Square, together with the building of Cambria House, nicknamed Dickman's Folly by the locals, dramatically altered the approach to the town. Gerald Oliver was for many years chairman of Haverfordwest Civic Society, and I discussed with him the many changes which had taken place.
I think what I've most regretted is the constant physical erosion of the town, the destruction of one building after another. I think possibly the first to go, though I'm not sure about this, was the building on the corner of Market Street and High Street above the crypt.
Yes.
That went, and then not awfully long afterwards, of course, the Butter and Fish Market was demolished, I think at the beginning of the 50s, wasn't it?
Yes.
51. And over the years, I think so much of the town has gone. There's been this constant chipping away. Yes. And of course, you know, when we think back, the squares of the town have been destroyed.
Yes, indeed.
Salutation Square has gone. The square in front of the churn works has gone.
That's right. Castle Square has changed.
Castle Square's changed enormously. Bridgend Square, Swan Square gone. I remember going down to look at the Swan Hotel just about the time that was demolished, which I suppose was early 1960s,
Yes,
if I remember rightly. Going down there with, I think, Roger Worsley. When we got there, the hotel had gone. It was just a heap of rubble. Whoever was demolishing it got wind that there were some objections. And they moved the whole thing forward a day or so. Of course, one of the buildings that were very happily saved, the old surgery in High Street, and what was Green's Cycle Shop, of course, now the National Parks office, and thank heaven those were saved. And again, a group of people were involved in opposing the demolition. At the end of 1969, there was a public inquiry in Foley House, remember?
Yes, I do remember that.
And I particularly remember Roger Worsley and Robert Kennedy being there, both, of course, Civic Society members after this public inquiry. And as a result of all the fuss, the society was established, in fact. Not by any of us, but I'd like to think the society has done a lot for the town, but I'm afraid a great deal of destruction has occurred since.
Yes. Because I particularly I think about the places you mentioned, like the disappearance of the Swan Hotel, the disappearance of the old part of the Castle Hotel.
Yes,
you mentioned lighted windows earlier on. When I worked in the Telegraph in Bridge Street, I remember coming around that corner on a winter's night, perhaps Christmas time, and seeing the old coaching house there.
Yes.
With the arch where the coaches used to go in.
Yes.
On a winter's night with snow on the ground, and it was really Dickensian. It was a lovely sight, and now it's all spoilt, really, isn't it?
I know that at an earlier period, the yard of the Castle Hotel was a place where men used to trade ferrets, and goodness knows what else.
Sticking to the subject of the old town being spoiled, I also I deplore the way they've broken into the terraces at Victoria Place and Picton Place.
Yes.
I mean, those were beautiful Victorian terraces.
Yes, they were good terraces.
Yes. And that accretion on the Castle Square end.
Oh, dreadful. Number one, Victoria Place, isn't it?
Any of the perspective lines anywhere?
No.
Scale?
It was superficially remodelled, I think at the end of the last century, with Victorian mouldings round the windows, and a bay window was added overlooking the Castle Square, but quite a tasteful job. Then, of course, eventually that was demolished, and the present disgraceful building put up, which completely destroyed both the integrity of the terrace and the integrity of the square.
And what was originally the Tesco building, which is now Iceland.
Yes.
I mean, it's completely out of scale.
Totally.
It's broken into the terrace between Picton Town House and the rest of the building.
Yes.
And it's you know, it's like an overgrown tooth in the middle of a decent set of dens.
Yes, it is, yes. Mm.
But it is sad what's happened to the town. And in the 60s, I think there was a lot of building out of scale and out of character.
Yes.
The telephone exchange, for instance, which dwarfs...
Oh, the telephone exchange is possibly the worst building. It's one of the sad things about Haverfordwest, is that there's very little good modern 20th century architecture. No. The only building I can think of that I would quite rate is what was the electricity board office up the Fishguard Road, opposite Withybush Hospital. I know it's a plain and severe building, but it's honest and straightforward.
Yes.
But otherwise, the 20th century has not been kind to the town.
No.
One of the sad things about the town, I think, has been just the moment when fashion has come round, and certain buildings have looked very interesting, such as a power station, such as the County Theatre. I don't think a lot could be said in favour of the County Theatre as a building, but the frontage onto Picton Place was
magnificent, yes.
Very good.
It was.
1935, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
And that was splendid. Was it?
Mr. Hammond was mayor at the time.
Oh, I didn't know that,
His
yes.
daughter Doris was mayoress.
Oh, yes. That's right. His wife had died, who was my great aunt, of course. And, yes, Doris came in as mayoress.
That's right.
Another building that suddenly disappeared one day without me even realising it had gone, which again would now be very much in the forefront of modern historical architectural fashion, was the lighthouse on top of Green's Motors.
Art Nouveau, sort of like...
Yes, Art Deco. Yes,
Art Deco.
Yes.
Yeah.
Terrific. And suddenly, at the moment that seemed most interesting, down at Kay.
Yes, it's very sad that so many areas have changed. I mean, Salutation Square has changed beyond recognition.
Yes, a building, rather to jump ahead of myself, which I quite admired in a way, was Bland's Garage, the old Bland's Garage, built, I think, in the 50s. Wyn Jones was architect. And I think it was a very good effort, a curved building, of course, to suit its site. And also echoing what we would remember as Thompson's paper shop across the road, which also had a curved frontage.
I must say, I think that the County Council have done a rather better job, although it is perhaps in the wrong place, a little out of scale, but I think County Hall is quite an attractive building.
I see what you mean. I don't terribly like it. I remember when I first saw the plan of it, I felt it was more a question of scale than anything else. I think it was on the wrong site. And I heard a suggestion made when, of course, it was, well, I think it was put forward informally, that it should have been sited roughly on the station yard site, where I think it would have been very impressive at the entrance of the town. But I think as it is, it has swallowed up that side of the river, when perhaps something else could have happened.
And from certain aspects, it blanked off the castle, which I think is sad, because I think the castle is an imposing...
Yes, it does act as a curtain as you, well, as you come along Freeman's Way. I think one of the best views of the new County Hall is from Price & Sons' rear windows, looking down and across.
There are some aerial pictures in Picton Centre, and they show it up quite well, actually, from the air. It looks quite well from the air, perhaps, because it looks less tall. Maybe that, you know, it's just the scale of it that offends slightly. But the reflections in the river, I think, are quite pleasant, really.
Some years ago, well, there's no harm in recording this, I was up in my shop, up in the Green, and a couple of workmen came running into it. And, oh, Mr. Oliver, you own that house in Goat Street, don't you? I said, third one down on the left. Oh, Mr. Oliver, there are all cobbles in front of it. So I walked down with them, and we wanted you to see them, Mr. Oliver, because the boss came up and said, for God's sake, get those covered quickly before some bugger like that Gerald Oliver gets to see them. I don't know who the boss was.
Now for a brief look at one or two of the old family businesses which have traded from the same premises for generations. This fine old butcher's shop is one of them. Haverfordwest has many long-established businesses which have been in existence with the same family for many years. We think of Bland's, Greens Motors, Hockey White's and Vincent Davis. Today we're in Market Street. I'm talking to Mr. Dilwyn Roach James, whose family goes back well over a century in the butchery business. Dilwyn, could you tell us something about the origins of Roach James Butchers?
Well, we think we've been in business for about 140 years. My great-grandfather, who rejoiced in the name of Charlie Chuck, as he started as a cattle dealer and butcher. He didn't have a shop, he had a store in the old market. Then my grandfather started on the old bridge, number 2 old bridge, in 1893. And we came from there. In fact, my father was born on the old bridge in 1901. And we came up from there to the present premises. We've remained ever since.
We're in Haverfordwest High Street now in County Clothes, which older folk will remember as Tom Davis. And with me is Mr. Toby Rhys Davis, the latest generation of the family to run the business. Mr. Davis, tell us about the history of it.
Well, basically it was started in 1901 by my great-grandfather Tom, who was married to Blodwyn, and they ran it through to the 20s when my grandfather, Rhys Davis, took it over with his wife Myfanwy. They ran it through to my parents taking over in the 60s, and then obviously I'm here now, and it's still going. My parents are still involved, and yes, we're still going along quite nicely.
So you're getting your century up this year, are you?
No, we had our centenary last year, 1901. We started in Milford Haven and moved here, I think, six years later, so 1907.
We're now further down the High Street in one of the few establishments which are actually in their original premises. We're in Munt's the Jewellers, and with me is Mr. John Munt, present generation in charge. Mr. John Munt,
Derek,
tell us about the history of the
right, well, the business under its present name Munt started in the mid-1800s when my great-great-grandfather, Bisley Henry Munt, travelled from Buckingham to take up a job with a local jeweller in the town, who traded then under the name James Bevans. And then it follows a classic tale. He married one of James Bevan's daughters, Matilda, who incidentally, she had 2 other sisters, and both of them were qualified to work on the repair bench. And then he changed the name of the business, traded under Munt, and then his son, Fred, took over, followed by my father, Billy, and myself. And I also have a son, Paul, who is in the Birmingham School of Jewellery at the moment, about to start his 4th year, and hopefully will take over from me.
We're now down on Salutation Square, outside or inside Pope's Garage, one of the landmarks of Haverfordwest, which has been here since the 1920s, and I have with me Billy Griffiths and Cliff Rogers, 2 gentlemen who were apprenticed to the Pope family. Cliff, first we'll start with you. I think you started at the same time.
That's right, October 1959, within a week of each other.
Yes. With the Pope family?
With Mr. Phil Pope then.
Phil Pope.
Yeah, he was the boss here at the time.
Yeah. And Bill, you know a bit about the history of the Pope family.
Well, what I was told by Mr. Pope, the family came down in 1921. Mr. Pope Senior as chauffeur to Picton Castle, and he worked for Picton Castle then until 1926 when they rented this property off the estate, and they bought it then in 1929 with Mr. Pope Senior and his 2 sons then, Clarence and Philip. Well, they ran it, when did he die? 1950. Clarence, the oldest son, died in 1950. Then Philip and Mr. Pope Senior carried on the business, and then Philip carried on till his death in 1980.
1980, so it went right through.
Right through, yes.
Where did they actually come from?
The London area.
Yeah.
The London
Kent area, something like that.
Yes. Kent, the East End of London, that area.
And I believe they hired cars out as well as
yes, they hired cars. No, you're still on camera because I got an old receipt in there. Would that be any good to you?
We can have a look at an old receipt, can't we? They still have a receipt here for 1935. Mr. Fred Cole, a very well-known gentleman, whose wife, Councillor Mrs. Catherine Cole, is still alive in the town and living in Drury Lane. It's dated March 1935, £1.50 for the hire of car number DE6095, 4pence a mile. And the speedometer reading was 7,656. Incidentally, the telephone number of Pope's was then 185. It is now 76185. 762. So what of the town of Haverfordwest we know so well today? As the focal point of the county, the town draws its custom from far and wide, and its streets are kept busy with local people and visitors alike. Bridge Street is always full of shoppers, and the High Street, with its Georgian buildings, presents a fine entrance to the town, leading up from the hustle and bustle of Castle Square. Market Street, at the top of the town, now maintains an enviable reputation for specialist shops. A successful development in recent years has been the farmers' market on the riverside, specialising in local produce, as Kate Morgan explains.
Well, the farmers market started in Britain in Bath about 2 years ago, and it was really to bring local produce to local people. And with the agricultural industry that we have in Pembrokeshire, it was an ideal opportunity to bring local produce into the county, and the county town being Haverfordwest, the producers themselves chose to start a farmers market in Haverfordwest, and they, as the producers, either have to man the stand themselves or have someone who's involved in the company actually selling the produce, and the produce has to be either brewed, grown, baked, whatever, made by the man who's selling it. You can't actually buy in and sell on. That's the whole ethos, really. I would hope it would definitely become a permanent thing, that it remains in Haverfordwest, going, year on year on. I don't know whether it would ever become weekly. A lot of producers find coming every week is just too much out of their production time, really. I think the novelty, perhaps as it is at the moment, is outside. It's in a very good area here. Whether it may in time move indoors, I don't know.
But Haverfordwest also likes to let its hair down, and Carnival Day is as good an excuse as any. Meanwhile, the riverside offers excellent facilities for keeping cool.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Captain.
Item number 1 on the agenda, apologies for absence.
Well, I have no apologies, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Item number 2, minutes of the council meeting held on the 3rd of October 2000.
Move.
Second. Please show, councillors. Thank you.
But Haverfordwest Town Council have more serious matters on their minds, including arrangements for the annual procession downriver by the Lady Mayor in her capacity as Admiral of the Port.
I'm lifting you up there. Not jump, look.
Together with civic dignitaries from neighbouring Pembrokeshire towns, the beating of the bounds of the ancient port are carried out by proceeding downriver to the White Rock, whereupon a symbolic cannon shot is fired by a naval launch. An enjoyable evening of civic pride celebrating the maritime history of the town, invariably complemented by appropriate refreshments afterwards.
I'm standing here on the old bridge, built in 1726 at the expense of John Phillips of Picton Castle, and looking downriver to the new bridge built by William Owen in 1833. Owen's elegant terraces are still mostly intact, and his grand old Shire Hall still graces the High Street. The churches and most of the chapels have survived the centuries. The old castle still stands defiantly up there on the hill, as it has done since the 12th century. Yes, we definitely have much to be proud of in this lovely old town. And despite the ravages of time, Haverfordwest is still a special place, and her townsfolk a special people.